I'm Dr. David Litwa, and this is a preview of my course called Celsus, Attack on Christianity. In this session, I'll introduce Celsus and his life setting in the late 2nd century Roman Empire. In other parts of the course, I'll delve into what Celsus can tell us about the varieties of Christianity in his time, including Carpocratian and Marcionite Christianity. I'll also talk about the Jewish criticisms directed at Jesus, the famous criticisms that he was son of Panthera, and the details of Celsus's Middle Platonic philosophy, as well as his description of the Ophi diagram and its relation to Mithraism. On top of this, his theory of animal intelligence designed to undercut Christian anthropocentrism, and finally, what Celsus meant by the true logos in relation to what is called ancient barbarian wisdom. Now, you'll hear many people pronounce Celsus by Celsus, and that's perfectly fine with me. But as in common English, we have allowed Kaiser to become Caesar, I choose to make the C more sibilant. But the choice of pronunciation is completely up to you, and I warmly accept Celsus as the name of our subject. Who was this Celsus? Celsus was the first great critic of Christianity, the first Greek writer to compose a book-length attack on the Christian faith. Although other Greco-Roman writers like Tacitus and Pliny had briefly made biting remarks against Christians, they honestly knew very little about Christianity. Ignorant critics typically said that Christians were atheists, that they ate babies in secret, and committed incest under cover of darkness with their sisters. Celsus ignores such rumors and actually researches the book of Genesis and the Gospels in order to write his book-length attack called Ha'alethis Logos, which could be translated the true doctrine, the true account, or the true story. For instance, Celsus's critique of Genesis compares Noah's flood with the myth of Deucalion, criticizes the daughters of Lot for having sex with their own father, condemns Jacob for theft and deceit, blasts Jacob's sons for attacking a city and selling their own brother into slavery. Such sordid myths cannot be redeemed by allegory, said Celsus, because the allegory ends up being more sordid and unbelievable than the myths. Celsus's knowledge of the Gospels is even more extensive. He knows of the star rising at Jesus' birth and the Magi, whom he called Chaldeans. These scenes come from the Matthean Gospel. Celsus probably knew canonical Luke, according to which Jesus sacrificed and obeyed their ritual law, or at least his parents did so on his behalf. Celsus also notes the Lucan saying, "With God all things are possible." Although Celsus mentions the idea of Jesus as Logos and the Jews' request for a sign from Jesus in the temple, these points need not actually indicate that Celsus read the gospel attributed to John. But he might have known Acts because he refers to an original Christian unity, that early Christians had a single intent or purpose, language similar to what we find in Acts 4:32. Celsus probably knew at least one of Paul's letters as well. He alludes to 1 Corinthians 8:4, that a so-called idol is nothing, and to 1 Corinthians 3:19, that the wisdom of the world is bad or foolish. Celsus also read Christian writings that we no longer have, such as the Heavenly Dialogue and the Dialogue of Jason and Papiscus. Concerning the latter dialogue, we have just recently discovered a fragment of it. Clearly, Celsus had done his research. When did Celsus write? If he knew Luke and Acts, then he was probably writing in the very late second century. The first Christian writer to refer specifically to Luke and Acts is Irenaeus, who was writing in the 180s. Celsus perceived that Christians in his day were a large group. He noted that they could be hunted and led to execution, as happened in the city of Lyon during Irenaeus' lifetime. Celsus also referred to the quote unquote emperors who presently rule, which might indicate the co reigns of Marcus Aurelius with Verus between 161 and 169 of the Common Era, or of Marcus with Commodus between 177 and 180. But the reference to plural emperors might simply be generic, since Celsus could also refer to the emperor in the singular. Given that Celsus knew the Marcellians, a group of Carpocratians in Rome, as well as the Marcionite critique of the four Gospels, and probably some works of Lucian of Samosata, then Celsus was probably writing later than the 160s. Really, any date between 175 and 200 is reasonable for the true Logos, and evidence does not allow us to be much more precise. Where was Celsus from? Although some scholars have argued for Rome and Pergamum, there are problems with these views. Celsus never referred to native Roman mythology or to Roman cultic practices. He almost completely ignored Rome and its emperors until the final section of his work. Celsus's connection to Pergamum assumes that our Celsus is the one to whom Lucian referred as a writer against magic. But this Celsus was an Epicurean, whereas ours is a Platonist. The notion that Celsus was familiar with the cults of Cybele, Mithras, and Sabazius does not demand his presence in Asia, since these cults were well known throughout the empire. The general consensus is that Celsus spent at least some time in Alexandria. This view is supported by his specific and first-hand knowledge of Egyptian local culture and worship customs. For instance, Celsus knew about specific skills sold by ritual practitioners in Egyptian marketplaces, namely healings and exorcisms, invocations, and the projection of images. He described the magnificent temple gateways and precincts of the Egyptians, characterized by colorful awnings and solemn rites. He knew that within Egyptian temples were cult statues of specific animals, including cats, monkeys, crocodiles, goats, and dogs. Everyone of his time knew about Antinous, Hadrian's boy toy, but Celsus had greater knowledge of the raucous associations in honor of Antinous which plagued Antinopolis in Egypt, a city well down the Nile. Celsus also mentioned that the people of Naucratis, a Greek colony not far from Alexandria, recently adopted the worship of Serapis, and that native Egyptians called their high god Amun. Finally, Celsus knew the 36 daimones, namely the decans, in control over the human body, and he could even list some of their distinctly Egyptian names. Such knowledge of Egypt is not absolutely unique, but it is detailed and specific. Evidently, Celsus had more than mere book learning about Egyptian culture and customs. This was the kind of knowledge one would pick up by living in Egypt, at least for a time. To this distinctive knowledge, one can add key points where Celsus overlaps with other Alexandrian authors in points of detail. Celsus's accusation that the Jews worship angels, for instance, is also found in the Christian document called The Preaching of Peter. Celsus's attempt to relate biblical to Hellenic mythology, for instance, the Tower of Babel with the story of Otis and Ephialtes, as well as Noah and Deucalion, has a precedent in Philo. Celsus noted that wicked angels were cast under the earth in chains, a specific punishment from 1 Enoch, a canonical text in Alexandria, and a text that is also alluded to by the likely Alexandrian letter of 2 Peter, written toward the end of the 2nd century. Celsus's charge that the Gospels contain myths is seemingly answered in 2 Peter 1:16, where the fictional author says that we have not followed cleverly devised myths. Now, Celsus need not have sailed to Rome to become familiar with Marcion's teaching, although it is certainly possible that Celsus traveled to the capital and to other areas. By his time, the late second century, Marcionite thought had spread to Alexandria. Marcion's disciple Apelles had arrived in the city and had established a successful Marcionite community there in Celsus's lifetime. The same point applies to Marcelinians. Marcellina made a move from Alexandria to Rome in the late 150s or early 160s, yet Celsus need not have gone to Rome to encounter her circle. He could have known Marcellinians in Alexandria. Celsus never mentions Hermes thrice great or a Hermetic movement, but he was aware, I think, of Hermetic ideas. He notes, for instance, the Hermetic notion that the cosmos is God's child. Celsus felt disdain for the Egyptian animal cults, but he was open to seeing certain riddles about the quote unquote eternal forms in Egyptian theology. This Egyptian theology may, in fact, have been Hermetic. In his own day, Celsus spoke what he thought was a consensus position against the great deviation of Christianity and its cults. In the modern period, the presuppositions of Christianity have become mainstream, and it's hard, even for secular people, to think outside the theological box created by Christianity. We now have the hard task of bracketing our presuppositions and assuming nothing true at first. I don't teach this course on Celsus to defend either Celsus or Christianity. I teach it to open up a new world, a new way of seeing, an ancient way of seeing, so that people can learn to think outside the many boxes created for them by years of encrusted tradition and traditional speech about God, the world, and humanity. It is true that Celsus is only known through the material that Origen of Alexandria quoted in his own attack on Celsus. Thus, Celsus's true logos is indeed fragmentary and sometimes disconnected. At the same time, Origen generally quoted Celsus accurately and systematically. This is not to say that there aren't places where Origen paraphrased and rearranged his material. Overall, however, we can arrange what Origen quoted fairly confidently, and Origen's industry and repetition allows us to know Celsus in his own words. This is the title of my new translation of Celsus, where I repair the mistakes made by R.J. Hoffman's previous translation, his use of paraphrase, for instance, his tendency to create connections that aren't there in the text, and his occasional mix-ups between Celsus and Origen. My translation, new here in 2024, is the main textbook for my full online course on Celsus, Attack on Christianity. In this course, you'll find permanent access to my online videos, book summaries, loads of scholarly literature, recommendations for further reading, and the chance to get all your questions answered. You won't find this course anywhere else. The link is in the description. Join now for early bird pricing, which will end this Halloween, 2024.